As Mario mentioned, I do co-run Garamark Property Management, but I have been a landlord for the last 16 years. Some of you might be impressed by that. Others will probably think I'm a snot-nosed punk. But I tell you one thing, I did learn early on that as soon as you become a landlord, you assume a lot of responsibility and a lot of liability, and we'll talk about that briefly as well. As well as really you become a self-sustained business, and you have to think as a business person, even if you have one unit or if you have an apartment block, it doesn't matter. You're still in competition with other rental units on the market, and you're still in competition for a good tenant, a good long-term prospect tenant, because as landlords, you guys probably already figured out the formula, which is quite simple. A good tenant will make you, a bad tenant will break you. So how do you attract and maintain a good tenant? And I'll briefly touch on that as well. So let me talk first about liabilities. And I'm going to define liability in three different types of liabilities. One is obviously the, and everybody's aware of it, it's the injury liability. If somebody was to fall, if somebody was to get hurt, if whether it be the tenant or a subcontractor that works on your property, through some sort of negligence on your part, you are liable. There's monetary liability, of course. With liability in itself means that one way or the other you're going to be paying for it. And the third one I'm going to actually call regulatory liability, and that is liability for your places not to be up to standard, up to the current code, whether it be fire and safety, whether it be bylaw, etc. So how do we limit your exposure to liability? Quite simple. Know the codes, follow them. I'm going to try to convince you guys that, and from my experience, and we've managed over the years thousands of units, and we all come to the same conclusion every single time. Cutting corners will cost you at the end. It's a bad business decision. The bylaw, the code, or the landscape by which we run our units changes from time to time. It is your responsibility to be up to date when it comes to that. I know recently bylaw made it, and it hit the news. There's a few changes, but one big one that hit the news was about the temperature in the units. I'm not sure if, yeah, I think Peter will mention that. It is your responsibility to be up on that. You don't want to be behind the ball. You want to be ahead of the curve to keep yourself safe and keep the tenant safe. So know the bylaw code, know the fire and safety code. It's a different governmental body. They have their own codes when it comes to safety. It's egress, it's fire equipment, etc., etc. There's a health code. There's obviously the Residential Tenancies Act that governs the responsibilities and the rights of the landlord and the responsibilities and the rights of the tenant. Everything is online. Look it up, read it, kind of get a sense as to where things are. It's definitely in your benefit. So that's one way you're going to limit your liabilities, just being aware of it. The second way, obviously, there's insurance. There's general liability insurance. Everybody knows about that. That's tied to the property. But I don't know if how many of you know that there's also bylaw insurance. Have you guys heard of that before? Yeah. Talk to your insurance broker and say, does my policy have a bylaw insurance? And that means that if something was to happen due to this building not being compliant, you're more or less covered. Now, there are nuances between policies, but ask your broker on that. So now that leads us to tenant selection. Well, the big part about attracting a tenant, one is price. So it is beneficial for you to have your markets, to have your rents slightly below market rent. No different than a store across the street would have a sale on something just to attract somebody into their premise to buy the same item. And if you provide a healthy, clean, compliant property, that will increase your chance of finding and maintaining a long-term tenant who is responsible and who cares for the properties. Because the number one, I would say, financial loss is actually not vacancy, it's damage to the property. And we as landlords do not want to keep renovating properties every time a tenant moves out, and that could be, you know, a tenant moves in, 6 months later or less, they move out, now you have another $3,000 or $4,000 bill you got to pay. That's not a good way of running your portfolio. So that brings me to tenant screening. Now you guys should have this sheet. I don't know how many guys in your little package. I'm just going to touch briefly on some of the points here and maybe expand on some, and maybe you guys can ask me questions on this as well. I'm going to skip the first part, which is the residential tenancies order system, because it's touched upon later on. So let's look at references and credit checks. Okay? It seems straightforward, but I'm not sure as far as individual landlords how accessible you are to having the ability to pull credit on someone. I would think it's difficult. As a company, we had to go through a lot of checks and balances and so forth to get a license in order to pull credit. They might be a little more difficult for you guys, but I think Gord did a little bit of research and found that there might be some other, not Equifax, but some other credit check things you can do online. I'm not sure about those. Maybe Gord, at one time, maybe if you can expand if you know more about that, which is the first point here, credit check. Yeah. But I think landlords as a whole, private landlords, have a bit of a difficulty in this area. So if an applicant has poor credit, you kind of have to, what I do, and I'm the only person within my company that authorizes a tenant in the property. Even if they have poor credit, that could be, I look at the reasons why. When a tenant goes through a divorce, there's almost a guarantee they're going to have poor credit. That doesn't mean they're bad. That doesn't mean that they don't like to pay their bills. But a divorce is a messy thing. And depending on when the divorce happened, you might or might not overlook that. Sometimes I do overlook it because it is circumstantial. If they're young and they have no credit, get a co-applicant. Now, I'm not going to call them a guarantor because guarantor rules have changed. I don't know if you guys are aware of that or not. But a year or two ago, that a guarantor who used to be able to be responsible for the unit for the life of that lease now is only responsible for the first year. And after that, they automatically are scot-free. So we like to use co-applicants. So basically, if you like to guarantee it, become a co-applicant and a roommate in a sense in the unit. And that way you're liable for a longer period of time. And at any given time, let's say 3 years down the road, if everything's fine, you can always remove them from the lease. Call a previous landlord. There's a trick to that. If you call a previous landlord, they'll tell you everything's hunky-dory just so they can get the tenant out of their property. We all do it. Don't have to admit to it, but we all do it. If you have information on the owner prior to the last one, try to call them. That's where you're going to get your true answers. Employment history is a must. And that's straightforward. RTB database. So for a fee, I think if you flip over it tells you, for $15, right? Yeah, for the first however many, half an hour I believe, or whatever it is. And then however much per page, you can check their RTB history. So if there was any claims that they've put forward against the landlord, or if there's any claims against them, you would be able to see it. And it goes as far back as when the system was created. So that's a very, very good source. We do also it's a provincial, it's a Court of Queen's Bench, but it's a check on criminal activity, right? So it's a criminal check. We can't do a federal system, but we can do provincial. A lot of stuff is online as well. You need their birth date, you need as much information as you can about the applicant, and you'll be able to get information on them. And it's very good to get middle names and such because there's a lot of John Smiths around. You want to make sure you know who it is you're reading up on. Social media sites, now it's getting more and more popular. People like to post their partying and everything else on Facebook. You can check that out as well. Point number 6 here, homeowners becoming renters. We never go as far as actually going and finding out if they were a landlord or not. But a good sense, our RTB check is a good sense of that. If it's clear, chances are that it's obviously bodes well for them. But you can definitely do that. I mean, the digging part, you can dig as deep as you want. But as you're aware, I mean, that tenant also has options of other units. So the speed at which you're able to check references and do all these things is critical. Because if you take a week or two, you've lost that particular applicant. They would have found somewhere else. So make the decision for yourself of what suits you best. But the more information you know, the better it is for you. And then briefly, I'm going to touch upon after the tenant has moved in, what can you do? If you look at point number 10, and if you have more than one property, or even if you have one, I think this might be beneficial to you. So you can register with Manitoba Hydro, and you can do everything online. So a tenant move in, tenant move out, meter reads, check up if the tenant's account is in good standing, etc. So you don't have to call and wait, 20 minutes to an hour online. You can just, over the phone, you can just go online and find out. Water and waste, I believe if you register yourself as a landlord, which they should have you as an owner, they will send you notification if the tenant hasn't paid water. Point number 9, repairs. That's what I touched upon earlier. If you maintain a good, healthy, compliant unit, it's inevitable you will outcompete your other neighbor landlord for a good tenant. So I'm going to stop there, just so I don't go on and on and on. Is there any questions about screening, about liability? I've seen it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Going through some right now. No? Everything's good? Yes?
When you turn over a building that's absolutely bug-free, and the tenant phones you and says they find the bug,
you
been in there for a year.
Bed bug?
Yeah. And obviously, at that point, they brought them in.
You can't prove it, that's the problem. So the way
Well, who do you have to prove it to?
I'll tell you what we do, and we've, I don't want to say butted heads because we always like to work with authorities and within the mandates, but the argument of my place was bed bug free, this tenant came in and this tenant brought in the bed bug is a hard one to prove because what if it's a mailman?
That's not an issue.
No? What do you mean?
She says, I brought in a bed bug.
If
I
they
found one. Then the building had been completely renovated, been vacant for several years while this was gutted. Okay.
If you can prove, and everything's going to be a burden of proof, if you can prove because you have reports from exterminators or whatever it might be, that this was absolutely bed bug free. And is it a single family dwelling or is it a
multi?
Which complicates it even further, right?
Yeah, the only unit in the building that's
it complicates things even further. It's I know from experience you're not going to prove the fact that the bed bugs are there. The first round of treatments is going to be on you. What you can do, however, is make sure that the report that you receive from the exterminators says if the unit has been properly treated, and if the tenant did the things that they have to, which is their responsibility to get this unit ready for the extermination. If it hasn't been, then the second round, you have an argument saying, look, I did what I had to as far as my responsibility, but the tenant didn't follow theirs. I'm not going to keep putting good money after bad. And in that way, that's the only way you can proceed.
Should be documented with who and where.
You have to use, and I believe bylaw changed that as well. You used to be able to hire yourself or your buddy to go in there with a spray and spray for bed bugs, but now they require a licensed exterminator. So licensed exterminator is more expensive. There is more cost associated with it, But however, you also now have the burden of proof as a third-party professional that tells you, no, this unit was not ready. The tenant did not do what they were supposed to, and therefore the bed bug infestation will continue.
Yeah, well, that when the building was redone, it was, went to great lengths to make sure every seam, every baseboard, any parting walls, anywhere they could get in where they would normally hide is.
I totally feel you. Totally feel you. You're not the only one. This happens to absolutely everybody.
Okay, so
But I have not seen it.
first round's on me, second round's on them.
If they don't do it, if they don't treat the unit properly, if they don't get it ready properly, and you have to have a licensed, that's the key, a licensed third-party company to go in there and say that.
For the witness.
It can't be you. Yeah.